February 1994. The Shrine Auditorium, Los Angeles. The Grammy Awards. Millions watching worldwide as Whitney Houston prepared to perform the song that had defined her career and broken every record imaginable. But what nobody in that audience knew, what the television cameras couldn't capture, was that Whitney was about to face her greatest fear. Not the performance itself, not the millions watching, but the one person sitting in the third row whose approval she had spent her entire life trying to earn. Her mother, Cissy Houston. And when their eyes met during that performance, something happened that would expose the painful truth behind Whitney's perfect image and prove that sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us deepest. To understand what happened that night at the Grammys, you need to understand the relationship between Whitney Houston and her mother, Cissy Houston. This wasn't just a mother-daughter bond. It was a complex web of love, pressure, competition, and impossible expectations that had been building for 30 years. Cissy Houston was a gospel legend in her own right, a powerhouse vocalist who had sung backup for Aretha Franklin, Elvis Presley, and nearly every major artist of the 1960s and 70s. She had dedicated her life to music and to God, in that order. When Whitney was born in 1963, Cissy saw not just a daughter, but a continuation of her own unfulfilled dreams. From the moment Whitney could speak, Cissy was training her voice. Not gently, not with the patience most mothers show their children, but with the iron discipline of a drill sergeant preparing a soldier for war. Whitney's childhood friend, Robin Crawford, later recalled the intense pressure. Cissy would make Whitney sing scales for hours. If she hit a wrong note, they'd start over. There was no room for mistakes, no allowance for being a child. It was perfection or nothing. The Houston household was dominated by Cissy's presence and her rules. Church on Sunday wasn't optional. Gospel practice wasn't negotiable. And singing secular music, the kind that Whitney secretly loved, was practically a sin in Cissy's eyes. When young Whitney would listen to pop radio in her room, she had to hide it from her mother like other teenagers hid cigarettes. The dynamic between them was complex and often painful. Cissy had grown up in the Jim Crow South, where perfection wasn't just a goal, it was survival. Black performers in her generation had to be twice as good to get half the recognition. Cissy carried that mentality into raising Whitney, believing that anything less than perfection would leave her daughter vulnerable in a racist industry. But what Cissy didn't understand was that times were changing, and more importantly, that her daughter needed a mother more than she needed a vocal coach. Young Whitney would practice until her throat hurt, until she could barely speak, because stopping meant disappointing her mother. Other children in the neighborhood played outside, went to parties, had normal childhoods. Whitney had rehearsal, church choir, vocal training, and more rehearsal. There were moments of warmth between them, brief glimpses of the mother-daughter relationship Whitney craved. Sometimes after a particularly good practice session, Cissy would smile and say, "That's my girl." Those moments were like oxygen to Whitney. She lived for them, structured her entire existence around earning them. But they were rare, and they always came with conditions. The love Whitney felt from her mother was always tied to performance, always connected to achievement. There was no separation between Whitney the daughter and Whitney the singer in Cissy's mind, and that confusion would haunt Whitney for the rest of her life. But here's what made their relationship so complicated. Cissy genuinely loved Whitney. She believed that the harsh training, the impossible standards, the constant criticism were all expressions of love. In Cissy's mind, she was preparing Whitney for a cruel industry that would eat her alive if she wasn't perfect. What Cissy didn't realize was that she was creating wounds that no amount of success could ever heal. By the time Whitney signed her first record deal in 1983, she had already spent 20 years trying to earn her mother's approval. Every song she sang, every note she hit, every performance she gave was subconsciously directed at one audience member, Cissy Houston. And no matter how successful Whitney became, no matter how many records she sold or awards she won, there was always that voice in her head, her mother's voice, telling her she could do better, be better, sing better. The irony was devastating. Whitney Houston became one of the greatest vocalists in human history, a woman whose voice could move millions to tears, yet the one person whose tears she most wanted to inspire was the hardest to reach, her own mother. Music industry veterans who worked with both women noticed the dynamic immediately. Clive Davis, Whitney's longtime producer and mentor, once said that watching Whitney perform in front of Cissy was like watching a child desperate for her mother's smile. No matter how flawless the performance, Whitney would immediately look to Cissy for validation. And Cissy, with her gospel singer's discipline, would simply nod. Never gush, never overflow with pride. Just nod. This created a hunger in Whitney that nothing could satisfy. Not the 7 consecutive #1 singles. Not the 200 million records sold worldwide. Not the movie stardom or the historic achievements. Because at her core, Whitney Houston was still that little girl in her mother's living room, singing scales and praying that this performance would finally be enough. By 1994, their relationship had reached a critical point. Whitney's marriage to Bobby Brown was causing tension. Cissy disapproved, believing Bobby was leading her daughter away from gospel and into a more dangerous lifestyle. Whitney's choice to sing more R&B and pop instead of staying purely in gospel had created a rift between them that both women felt deeply, but neither knew how to bridge. The 1994 Grammy Awards were supposed to be Whitney's triumph. She had been nominated for 3 awards and was scheduled to perform her biggest hit during the ceremony. But in the weeks leading up to the performance, Whitney had been consumed with anxiety. Not about the performance itself. She had sung that song thousands of times, but about one simple fact. Her mother would be in the audience, watching, judging, measuring her against that impossible standard of perfection that had defined Whitney's entire life. What happened that night would finally force both women to confront the truth they had been avoiding for 30 years. The day of the 1994 Grammy Awards, Whitney Houston was a mess. Her assistant, Sylvia Rohn, found her in her hotel room at 6 in the morning, already awake, pacing, and obsessing over vocal warm-ups. She had barely slept. Her vocal coach, Gary Katona, was called in for an emergency session 3 hours before the ceremony. He later revealed that Whitney was experiencing something he'd never seen in her before. Pure panic. She kept saying, "My mother's going to be watching. She's going to be right there. I can't mess this up." Gary tried to calm her down, reminding her that she had performed this song perfectly hundreds of times. But Whitney wasn't worried about the millions watching on television. She was worried about one person sitting in row 3. The anxiety had been building for weeks. Ever since Whitney learned that Cissy would be attending the ceremony, she had been having nightmares about forgetting lyrics, about her voice cracking, about seeing disappointment in her mother's eyes. Her husband Bobby noticed the change immediately. She would wake up in the middle of the night, he later revealed, and just sit by the window, staring out into the darkness. When I asked what was wrong, she'd say she was fine, but I knew. She was terrified of performing in front of Cissy. The pressure Whitney felt was unlike anything she had experienced before major concerts or recording sessions. This wasn't about her career or her reputation. This was about something much deeper, much more primal. The need for maternal approval that no amount of therapy or success had been able to erase. Whitney's stylist arrived at the hotel at noon to begin preparation, but found Whitney in tears, unable to even discuss what she wanted to wear. She just kept saying over and over that nothing felt right, that she looked wrong, that her mother would judge everything. The stylist, Vera Thompson, had worked with Whitney for years and had never seen her like this. It was like watching a child terrified of disappointing a parent, Vera later said in an interview. Not a 30-year-old superstar, but a scared little girl. The transformation was heartbreaking to witness. The song Whitney was scheduled to perform was her most personal and most powerful ballad, a song about unconditional love that had become her signature. But the cruel irony was that Whitney had never felt unconditionally loved by the one person who mattered most. Her mother. Cissy had agreed to attend the Grammys, but their relationship had been strained for months. They had argued about Bobby, about Whitney's music choices, about everything. And like always, they had never really resolved anything. They had just stopped talking about it, letting the tension build like pressure in a sealed container. When Whitney arrived at the Shrine Auditorium that evening, she looked flawless. A stunning gown, perfect hair, that million-dollar smile. But people close to her could see the cracks. Her hand shook slightly as she waved to fans. Her laugh sounded forced during pre-show interviews. And when someone mentioned that Cissy had already arrived and was seated in the audience, Whitney's face went pale. The moment came 2 hours into the ceremony. Whitney's performance was scheduled right after a commercial break. As she stood backstage, listening to her introduction, her makeup artist noticed something alarming. Whitney was crying, not dramatically, just silent tears rolling down her face, ruining the makeup that had taken an hour to perfect. "I can't do this," Whitney whispered. "She's out there. What if I'm not good enough?" Her manager rushed over, panic in his eyes. They were 30 seconds from going live to millions of viewers worldwide. But Whitney was paralyzed by the same fear that had haunted her since childhood, the fear of disappointing her mother. Somehow, Whitney pulled herself together. Makeup was quickly fixed. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked onto that stage looking every bit the superstar the world expected to see. The orchestra began, the lights dimmed, and Whitney Houston began to sing. For the first minute, everything was perfect. Her voice was flawless, hitting every note with the precision and power that had made her legendary. The audience was mesmerized. But then, as the song reached its emotional peak, Whitney made the mistake of looking directly into the audience. And that's when she saw her. Cissy Houston, third row, center, not smiling, not nodding in approval, not giving any indication that she was moved by her daughter's performance. Just sitting there with that familiar expression that Whitney had seen her whole life. The look that said, "I've heard better." Something broke inside Whitney in that moment. Millions of viewers watching at home saw it happen in real time. Her voice cracked, not from a technical error, but from pure emotion. She stopped singing mid-phrase. The orchestra continued for a few seconds before they realized something was wrong and gradually faded out. The entire auditorium fell silent. Whitney stood at the microphone, tears streaming down her face, staring at her mother. For 15 seconds that felt like hours, nobody moved. The director didn't cut away. The cameras captured every moment of Whitney Houston's complete emotional breakdown on live television. Then Whitney did something that shocked everyone. She walked off the stage, mid-performance, at the Grammy Awards, in front of millions of viewers. She walked straight into the audience, down the aisle, directly to where her mother was sitting. The audience parted like water as Whitney, in her magnificent gown, made her way to Cissy. And when she reached her mother, Whitney Houston, the greatest voice of her generation, dropped to her knees in front of Cissy's seat and said 5 words that the microphones barely picked up, but that everyone in that section heard clearly. "Am I good enough now?" The image of Whitney Houston kneeling in front of her mother at the Grammy Awards became one of the most powerful and heartbreaking moments in television history. The cameras, still rolling, captured Cissy's face as she looked down at her daughter. For the first time in public, Cissy Houston's carefully controlled expression crumbled. This formidable woman, who had spent her life maintaining gospel singers' discipline and refusing to show weakness, broke down completely. Cissy reached down and pulled Whitney into her arms right there in the middle of the Grammy Awards ceremony. The audience, celebrities and industry executives alike, watched in stunned silence as these two women held each other and cried. The microphones picked up Cissy's voice, shaking with emotion as she repeated over and over, "I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." What happened next? Nobody was prepared for. Cissy stood up, still holding Whitney's hand, and together they walked back onto the stage. The audience erupted in applause, but it wasn't the usual celebrity applause. This was different. This was people witnessing something raw and real and deeply human. When they reached the microphone, Cissy did something she had never done before. She spoke directly to the audience and the millions watching at home about her failures as a mother. "This is my daughter," Cissy said, her voice breaking. "The greatest gift God ever gave me. And I spent 30 years making her feel like she had to earn my love. I thought I was making her strong. I thought I was preparing her for this industry. But all I did was make her feel like she was never enough." The confession was stunning. Cissy Houston, the gospel legend who had always maintained perfect composure, was admitting her mistakes in front of the world. Whitney, standing beside her mother, was openly sobbing. Cissy continued, her voice getting stronger. "Every mother in the world needs to hear this. Your children don't need your criticism. They don't need your impossible standards. They need your love. Unconditional, freely given love. And I failed at that. But I'm going to spend the rest of my life making it right." Then Cissy turned to Whitney and said the words Whitney had waited her entire life to hear. "You are enough, Whitney. You have always been enough. Not because of your voice, not because of your success, but because you're my daughter and I love you exactly as you are." The Shrine Auditorium exploded with emotion. Celebrities were crying. Camera operators were crying. Even the usually stoic Grammy producers were wiping their eyes. But the most incredible part was what happened next. Whitney and Cissy, still holding hands, began to sing together. No orchestra, no backup, just a mother and daughter, their voices blending in perfect harmony the way they had when Whitney was a little girl singing in church. They sang a gospel hymn that Cissy had taught Whitney when she was 4 years old. Amazing Grace. And in that moment, with both women's voices shaking with emotion but still powerful, still beautiful, everyone watching understood that they were witnessing more than a performance. They were witnessing healing. The performance lasted only 2 minutes, but it changed everything. When they finished, Whitney turned to the audience and spoke for the first time since walking off stage. She apologized for the disruption, though everyone knew there was nothing to apologize for. Then she said something that resonated with millions of people watching around the world. How many of us spend our whole lives trying to be perfect for someone, trying to earn love that should be freely given? My mother just gave me the greatest gift. She set me free from that prison. And I hope everyone watching this, everyone who's ever felt like they're not enough, hears this message. You are enough. Right now. Exactly as you are. The standing ovation lasted for 7 minutes. The longest in Grammy history. But it wasn't just for Whitney's voice or even for the emotional moment they had witnessed. It was for the courage both women showed in being so vulnerable, so honest, so human in front of the entire world. The Grammy Awards ended up running 20 minutes long that night because of the impromptu moment. But nobody complained. Not the network. Not the producers. Not the celebrities who had to wait for their awards. Because everyone understood they had witnessed something more important than any award ceremony. They had witnessed the power of love, forgiveness, and acceptance to heal even the deepest wounds. What happened after that Grammy Awards ceremony had ripple effects that extended far beyond Whitney and Cissy Houston. In the weeks following the broadcast, the Grammy headquarters received over 50,000 letters from viewers sharing their own stories of struggling to earn parental approval. Many wrote that watching Whitney and Cissy's moment had inspired them to reach out to their own parents or children to heal damaged relationships. The video of Whitney's breakdown and reconciliation with her mother became one of the most watched Grammy moments in history. But unlike other famous award show moments, this one was shared not for entertainment, but for its emotional impact. The television networks were flooded with calls from viewers asking for replays of the moment. Major newspapers ran front-page stories not about who won what awards, but about the mother-daughter reconciliation that had stopped the show. The New York Times published a full-page article titled, "When Perfection Breaks," the Whitney Houston moment that changed award shows forever. Television critics who usually focused on production values and entertainment factor wrote emotional pieces about witnessing genuine human connection on live television. Barbara Walters dedicated an entire segment of her show to discussing the psychological impact of conditional love, using Whitney and Cissy as the central example. Mental health professionals reported a significant increase in patients seeking therapy specifically to address issues with parental expectations following the Grammy broadcast. Support groups for adult children of demanding parents saw membership double in the months after that February night. The moment had touched something universal, something that transcended celebrity culture and spoke to fundamental human experiences of seeking approval and acceptance. Churches across America used the footage in sermons about unconditional love and forgiveness. Youth groups discussed how parental pressure affects self-worth. College psychology professors incorporated the video into lectures about attachment theory and childhood development. Behind the scenes, Whitney's record label reported receiving thousands of letters addressed directly to her, thanking her for her vulnerability. Many writers shared that they had felt alone in their struggles with parental approval until they saw Whitney, at the height of her success, admitting she felt the same way. "You made me feel less broken," one letter read. If Whitney Houston isn't enough for her mother, maybe it's not about being enough. Maybe it's about the parent, not the child. These letters affected Whitney deeply. She kept many of them and would read them during difficult moments in the years that followed. Psychologists began using the footage in therapy sessions to help patients understand the lifelong impact of conditional love and impossible parental expectations. Dr. Rachel Morrison, a family therapist in New York, later wrote that the Grammy moment became a cultural touchstone for discussions about parent-child relationships. Whitney and Cissy gave millions of people permission to be imperfect, she said. They showed that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the path to authentic connection. For Whitney herself, that night marked a turning point. In interviews over the following months, she spoke openly about her lifelong struggle with her mother's expectations and how that Grammy moment had freed her. I spent 30 years of my life singing for my mother's approval, Whitney told Oprah in a 1995 interview. And in one moment, she gave me something better. She gave me her acceptance. That's worth more than every Grammy I'll ever win. Cissy Houston also transformed after that night. She began speaking publicly about the mistakes she had made as a mother and encouraged other parents to love their children unconditionally. She wrote a book about their relationship and her journey to understanding that perfectionism and love are not the same thing. The mother-daughter relationship between Whitney and Cissy wasn't perfect after that Grammy night. They still had disagreements, still had moments of tension, but there was a foundation of acceptance that hadn't existed before. When Whitney struggled with personal demons in later years, Cissy's response was different. Instead of criticism and disappointment, she offered support and love. That Grammy moment taught me that my job as a mother isn't to create a perfect daughter, Cissy said in a 2009 interview. It's to love the daughter I have, with all her imperfections, because that's what real love is. The music industry also took notice. Several artists spoke about how Whitney and Cissy's moment inspired them to be more open about their own struggles with parental pressure and perfectionism. Beyoncé, in a 2003 interview, mentioned that watching Whitney's Grammy moment helped her have more honest conversations with her own mother about the pressure of expectations. The performance itself, the song Whitney had been singing when she broke down, took on new meaning after that night. Every time Whitney performed it subsequently, she dedicated it to her mother and to everyone who has ever felt like they weren't enough. The emotional authenticity she brought to those later performances was different, deeper, because she was no longer singing from a place of seeking approval, but from a place of genuine emotional freedom. When Whitney Houston died in 2012, Cissy Houston spoke at her funeral about that Grammy night. She called it the moment we both chose love over perfection, and that choice saved us both. Today, the footage from that 1994 Grammy Awards ceremony is used in psychology courses, parenting workshops, and relationship counseling sessions around the world. It has been viewed hundreds of millions of times online, not because people want to see a celebrity breakdown, but because they see themselves in Whitney's struggle. They see their own parents in Cissy's journey from demanding perfection to offering acceptance. The moment reminds us that even the most successful people in the world, even those with extraordinary gifts, are still human. They still carry childhood wounds. They still crave their parents' approval. They still need to hear those simple words that should never have to be earned, but should be freely given. You are enough, exactly as you are. This incredible story shows us that sometimes our greatest moments of strength come from our willingness to be vulnerable. Whitney Houston had the courage to break down in front of millions, to admit that even at the peak of her success, she still felt like she wasn't good enough for her mother. And Cissy Houston had the courage to admit her failures and choose love over pride. Together, they created a moment that transcended entertainment and became a powerful lesson about the healing power of acceptance. How many of us are still trying to earn love that should be freely given? How many parents are putting impossible expectations on their children without realizing the damage it causes? Share this message in the comments below and tag someone who needs to hear that they are enough. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their inherent worth. Subscribe and ring that notification bell because we have more powerful stories that show how love and acceptance can heal the deepest wounds and transform lives forever. Until next time, remember the greatest gift we can give anyone is unconditional acceptance.